Time for another video with just Mr. McKenzie this time. This one is on factors and finding something called the greatest common factor. Oftentimes we refer to it as the GCF. So go ahead and get your notes page set up. I would start a fresh page for each video. Start with your title up front, Factors and Greatest Common Factors lesson. Our learning target, 6NS4, find common factors and multiples. And then our I can statement. I can find the greatest common factor, the GCF, of two whole numbers less than or equal to 100. That's our goal for today. So let's start with what a factor is. Factors are numbers that can be multiplied to get your number. Think of them as the pieces you use to create your number. So think about what would I multiply together to get to a particular number? Those are the factors, the building blocks that make up my number. So get that term and that definition down, and then let's try an example here. What are the factors of 24? So basically think of what are all the numbers I could multiply together to get 24. The easiest way to do it is think of them in pairs. What times what gives me 24? So I could multiply 1 and 24 together. I can multiply 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Those are all of my factors. Think of them as pairs. It'll kind of help you keep track of each one of them as you go. But they're all the numbers that I can multiply together to get 24. Those are its factors. A couple more vocabulary terms for us. These we should be familiar with. First is a prime number. A prime number is a whole number that has only two factors, one in itself, meaning the only thing I can multiply together to get that number is 1 times the number itself. So some examples would be the number 2, or 3, or 5, 7, 11, 13. If you think about it, the only thing I could find and multiply together to get 5 is 1 times 5, or 1 times 11 to get 11. Those are the only things I can come up with, so they're prime numbers. Composite is everything else. Composite is a whole number that has more than two factors. So it might have 3, 4, 5, could have a dozen different factors. But basically, when you ask yourself, what can I multiply together to get to that number, you come up with lots of options. So something like 4, because I could do 1 times 1, or sorry, 1 times 4, or I could do 2 times 2. There's more than one pair of numbers I could use. 12 would be a composite number, because I could do 1 times 12, I could do 3 times 4, I could do 2 times 6. There's lots of possibilities. So basically, if you can think of more than just 1 times the number itself, it's a composite number for us. You don't have to jot this part down, but just a little tip for us. A good way to find factors for a number, if you're not quite sure, is use your multiplication table. Say I want to find the factors of 36. So I search around in my multiplication table for 36 in the middle. It's in the 9 and the 4 row. So 9 and 4 are factors of 36. Here I find, let's see, got a 36 here. Well, it's also a factor of 6 and 6. Here I can find it with 9 and 4 again. So there's lots of ways of kind of searching around, find your number in the middle, and then follow it out to the edges. Those are some of your factors for that number. So you get stumped, use your multiplication table to help out. So let's try a couple together. Again, a good way to do it is kind of list them as pairs. So what are all the numbers we could multiply to get 20? Well, I could do 1 and 20. Don't forget that easy one. Sometimes I like to draw them with little rainbows to kind of match up the pairs. I could do 2 times 10. So that's another pair. I could do 4 times 5. That's another one. I've listed all the possible combinations that I can multiply together for whole numbers that give me an answer of 20. So how about 42? Always start with the easy one. 1 and 42. This one's a little tougher, so let's work through it together. We could do 2 times 21. We could do 3 times 14. Almost forgot that one there. And then we have the one that you probably most likely thought of, 6 times 7. But again, if you kind of think of them as pairs, it helps you make sure we don't miss any. Because chances are, if you can think of one of them, finding its matching partner goes nicely with it. Last one, 55. So I could do 1 and 55. I could do 5 and 11, but that's about it. In this case, there aren't many factors for 55. But it's really just thinking of what are all the different numbers I could multiply together to get my number, in this case 55. Our last term is greatest common factor. A lot of times we refer to it as the GCF. This is the number we're kind of building up to for this one. So rather than finding all of the factors a number has, or all the factors two numbers have in common, we want the greatest, meaning we want the largest factor, so the largest number that could go into both of my numbers, that they have in common, meaning that they share this factor. It shows up in both lists. So rather than looking at everything they have in common, we just want to know what's the biggest number they both have in common. So let's try one together. 30 and 72. We want to know what's the largest number that I could use to make a 30 and I could use to make a 72. So first we list out all our factors. We have 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. 72, there's a big list here. 1 and 72, 2 and 36, 3 and 24, 4 and 18, 6 and 12, and then 8 and 9. So we have a lot of numbers that they have in common. I see a 6 in both lists. I see a 3, a 2, and a 1 in both lists. But the greatest common factor, the GCF, is the largest number that showed up in both of those lists. In this case, that's our 6. So our GCF is 6. It's the largest factor that worked for both numbers. All right, 2 last examples. If you feel comfortable tackling this on your own, go ahead and try it. Check your answers with me when you're done. If not, follow along. We'll do a couple of them together to make sure you're comfortable with it. So 21 and 35, we want to find the GCF, the biggest factor they both have in common. So we start by listing out our factors. 21 is 1 and 21. Then we have 3 and 7. Not a whole lot for 21. For 35, we have 1 and 35. We have 5 and 7. So in this case, there's not a lot to choose from. Our greatest common factor is the biggest number that shows up in both lists. In this case, that answer is 7. So let's try it with the last one, 16 and 40. So I have 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 times 4. So we just list the 4 once. For 40, we have 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, 5 and 8. So we list out all of our factors, and then our GCF, our greatest common factors, what's the biggest number that appeared in both lists. In this case, we had a 8 in both lists, so our greatest common factor is 8. Remember, when all else fails, every pair of numbers is going to have 1 as a common factor, so you can always find at least something, but we want to find out what's the biggest number. So in this case, 8 is going to be our largest common factor.